Welcome to Chapter 6 of Glamador's DFO Sprite Editing Tutorial video series. Today we'll be discussing complex recolorations using Photoshop scripts and batching. The attack we're going to be looking at today is Bloodlust for the Berserker, which is in Swordman Effect Grab Blast Blood.npk. Now here we have the files. We have the blood spurt, which is what we're going to be editing, and its corresponding dodge layer. Now this may be your first experience with dodge layers. And what these are layers in which anything black in the sprite becomes transparent in DFO. It is used almost exclusively for adding lighting and effects to other skills, but some skills use dodge layers exclusively. Specifically, all of the Nen skills use dodge or light layers, as they're sometimes called, to do all of the skills because they're supposed to glow. But the problem with that is that they have no underlying normal layer, which is opaque and has texture and things you can see with the naked eye. Dodge layers are only solid colors in varying degrees of transparency, which show up as bright glowing lights in DFO. Now, this is the glow that you see around the edge of Bloodlust whenever you attack. And if we want to change the color of Bloodlust, we also have to change the color of this dodge layer. Otherwise, we'll have, say, a blue Bloodlust with a red glow. So we don't want that. So go ahead and save both of these if we're going to edit them. And now we're going to open these up in Photoshop. Now I'm using Photoshop today because I actually don't know how to do scripting in Paint.net. But I'm hoping that by seeing how it's done in Photoshop, you can understand it well enough to maybe figure out the technique in Paint.net yourselves. Or, if you have access to Photoshop, this is a whole tutorial. Anyways, in Photoshop, it's more powerful and at the same time a little bit stupider than Paint.net, because you'll notice if we use a hue effect on one of these layers and then try and do it again on a different layer, it did not save what we did. So we don't know what we did, and we can't go back and make it exactly the same as before. So we have to use something called scripts or Photoshop actions, as you'll see over here, to affect that change across all of these at once, make it repeatable. Let's go ahead to the History tab and go back to the beginning. And you can find the Actions tab over here in this sidebar, or if it's not over there, you go to Window, Actions, or Alt F9 is the shortcut key. Now once we have the Actions window open, we go ahead and we create a new folder for our actions. We'll call it Video Examples. And then we create a new action using this button right here. Call it Hue Stuff. And hit Record. Now any action we take is going to now be recorded that we're going to do here. So let's go back again and do that hue. Mess with all the sliders, blah, blah, blah. Now we hit Stop. And you'll notice that if we apply hue stuff by hitting play, it will apply it the same to every layer that we do. Let's just undo that for now. That was just an example. Now, this is only one of the things we can do. We can do much more complicated stuff using actions. We can adjust the hue, we can change anything we want. We can even draw on it, and that will be considered an action. If we go ahead and hit record again, we can add new elements to our action, which will be recorded alongside our hue. Things like layer properties, or select all, or delete selection. All of those things can be recorded. Now, we don't want to do those things. So we're going to go ahead and use Control-click to select all of those and remove them from our action. Now it's back down to just plain old hue. And let's go ahead and undo what we did there. Now, this is useful in and of itself because it allows us to have infinitely complicated, repeatable actions that we can apply to multiple layers. But in order to apply it to multiple layers at once, you need to use what is called the Batch tool in File, Automate, Batch. Now, Batch has a couple of options. First, you figure out which folder you're in. In this case, we're in Video Examples. Then, which action to use. There's only one at the moment, called Hue Stuff. And then we can determine what we want to do it to, either all the open files we have in Photoshop, 0 through 5, or a folder. Say I wanted to apply this to that entire folder at once. the entire grab blast blood, both the dodge and the normal. Now, you see we can do that just by hitting OK and then include all subfolders. If you don't include all subfolders, it will only edit images inside that folder but not any other folders. Since this is the overall effect folder for Grab Blast Blood, we have to include the subfolders, otherwise it won't recognize there are any files in there. So you can ignore this. You mostly always want to save and close when you're doing a batch, but down here is more important. You don't want to stop for errors because that'll stop your entire batching process. If one thing goes wrong in a batch of 100, then you have to go back and redo the entire thing, and it's terribly tedious. So go ahead and log errors to a file. You can save the file anywhere. I put it right here in my MPK extractions. See the log there? And we're going to go ahead and hit OK. And you'll see that it starts applying our action hue stuff to the entire folder at once. And it does it pretty fast. All done. Now if we look back over here, all of these have been changed to blue, as have all of these. Now, this is going to be your most powerful tool when dealing with complicated recolorations, because you have to apply it to sometimes hundreds of files across multiple folders all at once if you want to effect a large-scale change in the color or texture or anything of the sprite that you're looking at. Now, unfortunately, now that we've saved and closed these, we can't actually go back and put them back the way they were. So I'm going to go ahead and reopen the DNF extractor, analyze, and resave those pics. Now you'll notice that doing that overwrote the pics that we already had in this folder. So if you want to go back to the beginning but you still want your pictures saved, you might want to go ahead and copy these and put them in a new folder before you do your batching process. But it's important to remember that when you do this, you also have to be wary of the fact that if you select include subfolders on this, you'll be doing not only this, but also the little subfolder you had for saving. So you have to save it in a different location and be careful of which folders you're actually selecting in your batching process. Now that batch can apply to anything, but it's important to remember that the batch only goes as far as you could actually doing the action in Photoshop. So one of the things that you should be aware of when performing these actions is adding new layers and changing layer properties. If I add a stroke to this and make a new layer, or 2 or 3, and just draw all over it. Now, when I try to hit Control S, this will try and save it as a Photoshop.psd, and we don't want that. That's a Photoshop document. DFO can't recognize that type of file. We have to save it as a .png. But when batching, we can't go in and manually click ping save every time, otherwise it completely defeats the purpose of having a batch file. So what we want to do in preparation is, if we're doing something like this, we want to go over here and in our action, let's make a new one. Messing up. Alright, so we go over here and we perform that same action. I'm going to add a stroke, create 2 new layers, and draw on them a little bit. There. Now let's go ahead and stop that. Now you'll notice that all of our actions there were taken up in here. We had the set layer style, the make layer, the select layer that we were doing. Let's add a couple more actions here, ones that will help us to save it as a .ping. You have a handy tool here in the script section, File Scripts, which says Flatten All Layer Effects. And what that does is it takes all of those effects that we had and makes them uneditable. It rasterizes the layer, making it just one solid block. And Photoshop no longer needs to save that as a PSD. Next, we want to do what is called flattening all layers, or merging the visible layers. Important to note, if we use flatten image like this, it zeroes out our transparent background, and all DFO sprites have transparent backgrounds, so we do not want to use flatten. We want to use merge visible. That merges all of the layers that has a little eyeball next to it. So go ahead and stop that and remove that flattened image. We don't want that in there. There we go. Merge visible. Now you'll notice if we go over to 2, we can run this. Yep. And it applies the exact same thing to it that we did before. All the way right down to the dragging around that I did before. It does all of that in the action. But the best part of this is we can now run this batch without errors to all opened files. And since we flattened the layer effects and removed all excess layers, it no longer defaults to a .psd because it bears all of the properties of a ping file. And since it was opened as a ping file, it first looks to save it as a ping file if there's nothing else making it think differently. Now, unfortunately, there was something that made it think differently for these two that we edited before, and that was probably because the stuff that we did, we never went back and put it back in its original history state. So let's go ahead and do that and run the batch again. And there you'll notice it ran without any problems. So that's a basic walkthrough of how to use Photoshop actions and scripting to effect large-scale changes to a large number of files with minimal work to yourself. Now I'm going to go over a couple of Photoshop techniques that you can use to edit your sprites in more complicated ways. Once you've got your sprite uploaded, you can go ahead and find it and replace map, replace all, just like before. Find your directory and put it in there. Unfortunately, there's no batching that I know of for the DNF extractor. If you wanted to, you could write a script which replaces the files, but you would have to type in the folder that you're going to and where it's going and all of those details before actually clicking, and that's really no more work than just right-clicking and replacing each of them one by one. Now, this can be a real pain if you've got like 7 and 8 and 9 and 12 and 20 different layers to your sprite, but this one we only edited 2 things, so we can do that with minimal work. I'm not going to do it on video because I didn't really want to put this monstrosity in the game. That's just a crime against humanity. But we are going to look at something else. Now, you may recognize this sprite as one of the Full Metal Alchemist avatars that I was using as an example in the last video. So let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so we can see what we're doing. There are a lot more actions you can take in Photoshop than just messing with hues, and I have that in my Hue of the Day folder. This is where I keep all of my actions for recoloring things, right down to my hue and my hue map, which I showed you how to use in a previous video, selecting a gradient and applying it to the entire thing at once. We use that in order to reduce the color palette before, but you can also use it to just plain old change the color of a sprite you want to work with. And that's one of our 2 methods of changing the hue. And sometimes you want to use one, sometimes you want to use the other. But remember, whenever you use the set layer styles, you always have to have a flatten all layer effects in the script as well if you want to use it for batching. Now, some of the more complicated things we have down here are selective color and replace color. Now, you can find those under image adjustments, replace color, and selective color. Now, when doing these things, if you've already got an action created, you don't want to go into your Image Adjustments tab, because then you have to create a new action every time. Once you have the action, you can go ahead and click on it. See, it's at 18 now, but if I change it to 43, and then I run that, it will always change it by 43. It will change it by the last thing that I did. So whenever you've got an action, always click on the element of the action rather than starting a new one. It's just more efficient. For instance, in selective color, this can only be done on RGB format colors, RGB format sprites. Some sprites, or not sprites, but some images that you may want to import into DFO will come in different color modes, which Ping supports, like indexed color. Like up here, you can have mode, grayscale, indexed color, these things, different bits channels. If I use index color, I am only going to use those 4 colors that I've got. And you've got the color table to show that only those 44 colors are used. But selective color can only be used on non-indexed files. So what we want to do is we want to put this convert mode, which I saved, as mode RGB. Now any file that comes into here is going to convert it to an RGB, and then it can use selective color. And what selective color does is it opens up this neat little window here, which you can pick out different shades of color and edit them at will. Now, say we want to change Winry's jacket. This jacket is a shade of blue. So go ahead and click on blues, and we can sort of adjust these sliders back and forth to affect a color palette change on Winry's jacket. Now notice that only blue colors are being affected. We made it a little bit more purple here. Now, it's important to know that these are not normal RGB color scans here. These are cyan, magenta, and yellow. Now, you have to work at these sliders a little bit to determine exactly what combinations will make what colors. It basically follows primary colors, blue, red, and yellow, but they are substituted magenta for some reason. Cyan and yellow make green, and you can use these sliders to make all sorts of colors, like this lightish gray blue. And if you want to adjust this slider down here, that affects the lightness of it, up and down. Now, you're not going to see much difference if I have them all at 0, but if I put them in the middle and I adjust this slider, you can see it adjusts the brightness and saturation. The default is 0, and you can adjust that up and down with your mouse wheel, typing in numbers on your own, or moving the slider. If you want to zero it out, just tap 0 on your keyboard. Oops. Just tap 0 on your keyboard. 0, 0, 0. Now, down here is a little thing called relative and absolute. Relative means that it's going to adjust the colors with all of the rest of the colors of the image in mind. Absolute means that it's just going to adjust the colors based on the sliders, period. And that usually affects a greater change with less consideration for saturation and lightness. You can see that this purple is sort of less subdued than this purple. Notice how there's more purple to go around, so to speak. Now, if you want to affect a large change in color, you're usually going to want to have absolute checked, because relative is just too subtle for my tastes. But it looks good here, so let's give her a green jacket. And I've also noticed that her boots are a little bit too gray. So I'm going to go into the blacks, and I'm going to make them even blacker. So she has black boots and a green top. Now, I don't like her hair, so let's go ahead and change the color of the hair. So we're going to go ahead and make it purple. Yes, definitely purple. But you'll notice here that with relative, it's a much softer purple. If we check over on absolute, it becomes much harsher, because it's no longer taking into account all of the other elements of the sprite. But no matter which one you use, you'll notice that the elements of yellow in her skin are being changed along with the elements of yellow in her hair, which is making her whole palette look a little bit more purple. And we don't want that, so let's go ahead and hit 0, 0, 0. We'll have to edit her hair a different way. For now, hit OK. And we can apply that if we wanted to open up a different Winry sprite, say this one, and we wanted to do that same process. We could take our action for selective color, run it, and look, she looks the same as over here. Very useful tool for editing avatars. But this process that I'm about to show you next is not batchable. You cannot do this on a batch. You have to do it on each layer one by one. Go ahead and select just her hair using the marquee tool. And then we're going to use replace color. Remember, that's an image adjustments replace color. And what I'm going to do is zero out all these values because we want to start from fresh. And we're going to hair color, this yellow here, using the eyedropper tool. Now it's going to take this yellow and adjust it with the normal hue, saturation, and lightness sliders that we've all come to know and love. But you'll notice that it only selects the exact color that I did. If I want to make her hair pink, like I said before, then I'm going to need to adjust this fuzziness scale. And the fuzzier you go, the more colors around this color yellow it's going to pick up, so to speak. And that's going to affect the exact same problem we had before. Notice her face is turning violet, and we don't want that. But that's what the marquee was for. This affected a color change in her hair, and what we can do now is use this history brush. If we make it a little bit bigger, and just sort of undo just the bit on her face. And now you can see, if we zoom out, that I've changed her hair without changing her face. The problem with that is that you again have to do it individually for each sprite. If you do it without selecting anything first, without using the rectangular marquee, then you're going to run into the exact same problem you had in selective color, which is too much fuzziness affects everything around it. And even if you try and hold shift to just affect multiple colors at once, there are elements of those colors in her knees and in her outlines. And even with fuzziness set at 0, it will change more than you want it to. But say you like this weird purple Winry. We can hit OK and go ahead and apply that over here, and it changes her purple too. So replace color is a batchable process, but using the marquee to only replace certain sections is not. So if you can go ahead and keep that in mind, you'll do just fine. And now you know pretty much everything I do about adjusting sprites and using Photoshop to affect large-scale changes in sprite colors and anything else really. All of my techniques are now known to you, and I hope that you can use some of your creativity to make some really neat alterations to DFO now that I've retired. Sort of training my replacements en masse, if you will. So I expect to see good things from all of you, my pupils. Next time, I'm going to come back with a surprise video on sound editing and how that differs from sprite editing in the DFO NPKs. So look forward to that.